few words and we'll open up questions.
Thank you. This is basically a time to hear questions and so on, but the whole purpose of this meeting was the fact the state has some very significant budget challenges ahead, and we cannot ignore the elephant in the room that could dwarf any state problems and could confuse everything we're doing. Both the fact that we didn't get into today about all the things that could throw the economy into chaos, the tariffs, the layoffs, the everything else, because any one of those economists will tell you the impact on inflation, on the speed of the economy's growth and everything else. Any economist can tell you that about any one of them, but they don't know what happens if this all happens at the same time, kind of amount of chaos, or that could do the state budget. And then, of course, these budget cuts, the potential ones, just the scope of them blows away everything else. Again, the numbers in here, most of those were annual numbers. So in other words, as Chair Wicklund said, those Medicaid cuts, just doing the one where they cut the enhanced medical assistance payments for those expansion population, just that would be $2.5 billion a biennium, which is bigger than the problem we were looking at 4 years out. And just that happens every biennium, we have that happening. So those are huge numbers. We just needed to have a presentation on this so we have a better preparation as we put our budget together. With that, I'll turn over to Majority Leader Murphy, and then we'll take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am really grateful to be with our seasoned members, our experienced members, and our very, very well-informed members as we are exploring this facet of the work that we have to do to balance the budget. And we are very committed to the work of balancing the budget for the people of Minnesota. And that's why this hearing is so important, because it allows us to start to tell a human story about what we may experience if the federal government, if the Congress continues to pursue the path that they're describing. I read 2 days ago that the Hill did a poll and suggested that 71% of Trump voters do not support the deep cuts to medical assistance and Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, those things that the Congress are talking about cutting. But more importantly, in my experience with the people of Minnesota, they have never supported hurting people who are sick, people who are elderly, people who are disabled, and our kids. That is not a place where Minnesotans have ever been supportive. And I think as we talk about balancing this budget, we can get lost in numbers, but the story has got to be about the people, our neighbors, our friends, our families, our communities, our jobs. And all of those things stand at risk if the federal government, if the Congress takes the action that they're talking about taking, supporting Donald Trump's proposed budget. And so it is, from my perspective, incredibly important that we start talking with Minnesotans about what we might see and its impact on our state's budget, but more importantly, the impact on their family budget, on the care of the people that they love. And as some people will say, this is a story about other people, but for me, this is a story about us. It is a story about who we are, what we believe in, who we're going to fight for the people of the state of Minnesota, and it begins now. And with that, I'm happy to take questions along with my very, very brilliant colleagues.
Leader Murphy, we heard some from specifically Republican members on the committee today about potentially next week hearing that the budget deficit is going to be worse. Have you heard anything about that? Could you attribute that to maybe what we're seeing in the federal government? I'm not asking you to speculate on what that forecast will be, but is there any validity to those rumors?
So I won't, of course, speculate on the forecast because I don't know what it will be. But I do know that the state's economist, the state demographer, the Council of the economists for the state of Minnesota are assessing the impact of what Congress is talking about. And Senator Marty mentioned things like tariffs. And we also know that there's a lot of disruption now across the globe. And all of those things have impacts on a forecast. So we will see next week. But what is clear to me is that the Congress is preparing to take action on their budget, which could have a very serious impact on the state's budget. That won't show up in the forecast, but we know that we may see that when they act on reconciliation in April, or we could see it later this summer or into the fall. And so we have to stay on our toes regarding the state's budget as we watch what Congress is considering doing to the state of Minnesota and to the people who live here.
Chair Marty, could you provide some context perspective? I think you've been around coming up on 40 years here. Have you ever seen anything like this before?
No. This is unprecedented. I think people want change at times, but planned, thoughtful change that makes sense. When you have people being laid off, because it's not a direct impact on the state budget when federal employees are laid off, but when you lay off thousands of people and shut down offices that they're doing, lay them off and then, oops, that was a mistake, and you come back, well, you laid people off 2 weeks ago, how many of them are gone and moved on to other things? I think the disruption of what's happening now, the biggest concern, other than these budget cuts, and these budget cuts, which we don't know the nature of them, but we know they're happening. The problem is that everything else is happening around that. The impact of a loss of huge chunks of employees does have an impact on the state economy. Tariffs have a huge impact on the state economy. Moving out certain workers and blocking new immigrants from coming in, farm workers and so on, those all have an impact on the state economy. And no, we've never seen anything like this. It's unprecedented, it's chaotic, and it's certainly uncertainties that any government or business can't happen. And this is not a Minnesota state government problem. 50 states are going to go through the same thing, and the state economies, it's not just state budgets, it's the state economies, it's the jobs people have or lose, or what happens with inflation. All of that's tied together with this. And no, we've never seen anything like this.
Can I follow up on that? Is it analogous at all to, some of the huge budget shortfalls? Governor Plenty called it the incredible Hulk of budget shortfalls. I mean, could we be looking at a scale like that?
Yes, more than that. The Plenty deficit, at the end of that time, that was big, and the state did address it. But again, just the Medicaid cuts, just the potential Medicaid cuts of what they're talking about, specific cuts, again, getting rid of the enhanced payments for the expansion pay population, that alone doubles or triples our budget problems for the next 4 years. Doubles or triples in one cut. That's without any change in the economy. So no, there's nothing like this in any of our previous governors, any of our previous legislatures. This is totally unprecedented, and I'm very scared that we're talking worse than recession for the economy on top of this, but we don't know. It's just too many things happening at once, and economists, they work off projections based on what's happened in the past, and there's nothing like this that's happened before.
On the floor, Peter?
Chair Marty, Leader Murphy, obviously there's a lot that we don't know, but we do know that there's a large deficit looming, and we do know that federal cuts are coming. So what's Democrats' plan to address that? How would you like to see it addressed in the state budget?
That's what we're meeting with our caucus now. We're talking with all the budget chairs, asking them to look at the budget needs, everything else, because we're serious about addressing our problem. We have to do it. We don't have a lot of time. We never do, and this year got off to a slower start, but we're going to address it. We're working on that now. We don't have any number. We're going to have the final budget numbers that we balance off of beginning March 6th. And so we will have, that's when we start putting together exact proposals and so on. So we don't have that yet, and we'll have to wait and see what the budget forecast says, because again, I don't want to speculate on that either.
Peter, we got to go.
Senator, I'm surprised you didn't read back from a letter that was sent to the delegation from Republican members of this legislature, including one whose name I won't mention because then he'll want to talk. Why didn't you mention that? Why didn't you read that back to them? They seem to have many of the same concerns that you have.
She mentioned the letter in the hearing, so I think she could.
Yeah, I mentioned a letter and proposed that maybe our committee, both sides of the aisle, could write a letter, basically making sure that the federal government knows that it is going to be really hard for us to balance our budget if they do go through with this. I think it's really unfortunate because in that letter they make it clear. Senator Grunhader, being one of those, made it very clear that cuts to Medicaid will be catastrophic for our state.
Thank you. Last one.
Leader Murphy, do you have a response to some of those concerns that are coming through from counties on some of the proposed cuts from Walz's budget proposal?
So we're going to propose our own budget in the Minnesota Senate. We will propose our own targets. And we will look at what Governor Walz has proposed. But that is a proposal coming from one part of the government. And it is the legislature's responsibility to balance the budget. The concern that I have, really, and as I spoke with the counties yesterday, is given the shifting landscape regarding human services, what they were talking about and their concern, what Governor Walz proposed is perhaps a footnote in comparison to what we will face. So I think we have to be very clear about our objectives and who we're going to work with and for in this budget, but understanding that there could be changes and cuts coming from the federal government that will ultimately shift all of that discussion, make it harder.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Appreciate it.